Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of James Tea Podcast, where we spin the James and spill the tea. And today we're coming at you with two new reviews for two new records. We're going to be talking today about the newest album from chillwave sensation George Clanton, his album Rapaya. And we're talking, of course, about the latest trap opus from Travis Scott, Utopia.
Every time I see that George Clanton album title, I just get like "ba-ba-ba-ya" from the Archandroid stuck in my head.
Yeah.
And I just start singing "Urapaya," even though that has yeah. So George Clanton, let's start with that. Let's start with George Clanton's album. This is an artist who I, until this week, was very unfamiliar with, almost like by choice. And it's like, I don't have a good reason for never listening to George Clanton before, even though he kind of fit. He's in online spaces, he's super popular and has a lot of, universally fairly beloved songs, and has really kind of carved out a name for himself as someone who's invested in artists of that level and kind of wanting to be, caught up with that stuff. It really makes no sense that I've avoided George Clanton for as long as I have, and I still haven't listened to anything that isn't this album. So this is still I'm coming at this just with this album. This new record is my only real knowledge of George Clanton. I kind of avoided him because I just kind of thought that George Clanton just being like one letter away from George Clinton was kind of like a joke. And maybe it's his real name. I don't know. I still don't know. I don't know if I want to know. For just really superficial reasons, I've just convinced myself, whatever, this guy's not for me. Fool I was. And maybe his previous for me, but fool I feel right now, because this new record, which, upon its release by its online, by Clanton's incredibly online fan base, was instantly valorized. What I was not expecting, I've heard him being tossed around in association with vaporwave and kind of hypnagogic pop of the mid 2010s. Again, I don't really know how accurate that is, but what I was not expecting was an album listening experience that reminded me of being a kid, hearing Primal Scream's Screamadelica for the first time, being a teenager, hearing M83's Hurry Up We're Dreaming for the first time, and also being a kid and hearing Chemical Brothers' Dig Your Own Hole for the first time. I was not expecting to be thrown into a fucking vortex of shit that is my shit. I was not expecting this record to take me away the way it did. I almost feel a little bit cheap saying this, but the start of the record, it starts off really, really quiet with a sort of really sort of turned down little percussive part. And then it just explodes about 5 seconds in. And it was like, I couldn't help but think of, Paranul Polaris earlier this year, the feeling you got when that just kind of bam, that just hit. But it was a bit different because it's like, you had 2 minutes of sustained build up that you didn't realize was leading to where it was. But here I just the wall of sound that cascaded down on me, that completely landed on my head when opening track Everything I Want roared to life. That's one of the musical moments of the year so far. And it is really, the album is a journey from there. I think it's one of those records where I instantly understand the hype. I instantly understand the complete iteration that this is getting. Now, I don't think it's quite one of the absolute tippy top tier best records of the year, like some people are holding it up as, but I do think it's a really great album that channels and synthesizes a number of influences into a melting pot of sounds that is staggeringly coherent for what it is, and that replicates the scale of these sounds that it's drawing from with such impressive clarity and hugeness that I'm stunned that it even exists, because it's the kind of record that feels like this must have cost, tens of thousands of dollars to make it sound the way that it does. And I know very little about George Clanton. I'm kind of enjoying the fact that I don't know much about him, that it's a mystery to me. Maybe he's hugely label backed and has is rich basically and has all these things at his disposal. But I wasn't expecting it to sound as lush and massive and invigorating and fucking IMAX as it is. This is an IMAX album, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, that's kind of the appeal of Clanton as far as I can tell. I'm not super familiar with him myself, but though based on the hype of singles for this, our friend Connor was like really looking forward to this album and talking about how much he enjoyed the album Slide, his last record, which I did listen to a couple of months past. And I really liked that album, but it was very much an album that like I enjoyed it aesthetically, and I don't mean to say enjoying an album aesthetically and enjoying an album shallowly are not the same thing, for the record. So when I say that, keep that in mind. But I enjoy George Clanton's music, Slide in particular, on a very aesthetic level. And Slide in particular kind of feels like an album that feels like it's building a sonic toolkit, establishing his grammar, for instance. It felt more like I don't want to like taint, like, for example, you haven't gone back and listened to Slide. I don't want to like taint an opinion of it or anything, but to me, it does sound like that is an album of him kind of getting ready to sort of lay out what he is going to do for the rest of his career. And this is him fulfilling the potential of Slide to me, with something that feels a little bit more hard hitting, fully formed, and all encompassing. I am like you, I really enjoy the kind of baggy influence that this has, mainly in not just the sound of it, but the overall continuing kind of flow of the record. That it's a really tight, like less than 40-minute long album, and it feels like, structurally speaking, a lot of these songs just kind of seek to immerse you, put you in this cocoon of immersive electronic sound, and just kind of allow you to gestate within them, kind of like these swirling hooks that just kind of wrap and coil around you, that you just kind of observe, and that the album will linger in and then eventually move on to something else. And it's propelled mainly by the sort of rhythmic elements of the album, the overwhelming presence of like this drum break that honestly, it kind of sounds like it's the same drum break on every single song. It kind of reminded me of the drum break that's on VPN on that Lil Ugly Mane album from 2021. It's a very similar sounding, sort of all-encompassing experience as that song, but this is a kind of chillier, sort of more like crystallized sound that makes you feel a little bit more like comforted. And George, as a vocal presence too on here, I feel like is an improvement from Slide, because these hooks to me are a lot sharper, though they still blend into the fabric of these songs really, really well. I think of hooks like on the song Justify Your Life, which is just one of the most immediate, hard-hitting pop songs of the year. Right after that, like Everything I Want, I think is a great introduction to the album, because it sort of showcases the kind of blueprint for what every song on here does, and just kind of lets you linger in it. It's not like a song that does much structurally, but it's just sort of teaching you how to listen to it, as it were. And then it sort of allows itself to naturally kind of evolve into Justify Your Life. And then like that like initial run of Justify Your Life, Punching Down, and I've Been Young are just like, it really does feel like Clanton is kind of throwing down the gauntlet and being like, this is what I am capable of as an artist. It feels like he is fulfilling the first arc of his career with this first set of songs. Not to downplay the second half of the album, which I do think is great and holds plenty of distinct highlights in and of itself, but it's really that kind of first half of this album that is just like a continuous stunner.
What really captured me, like overall about this, is how well it synthesizes so many different variants of what psychedelic music was from the late 80s through the late 90s. You've got that core kind of like, that core baggy roots within like Stone Roses and Happy Mondays, and I've already mentioned Primal Scream. We think of those core baggy bands are the biggest influence because they're the ones who took that psychedelic sound in the most ambitious directions. And then you've got that fused with this like acid influenced, house influenced late 90s big beat sound and the percussion and the thundering, thumping beats. And bringing those things together, like a band like the Chemical Brothers did in the late 90s, but bringing them together with this distinctly modern flourish, as well as the sensibility and the personality and the performance and the way that he sings and the things he sings about. It's like, I have something that is so distinctly reminds me of the melting pot of my childhood, but also feels like it belongs in this current moment. That's one of the things that's most exciting about it. Now, the thing about Urepaya that is like both where its strengths are, and also where its like, I guess, fundamental limitation is that there's a few really strong, fully formed songs on here, but for the most part, this is kind of just an album about the sonic landscapes, really.
Yes, totally agree.
Like I do think that I mean the biggest standout single, the one that most people love, and I think almost inarguably the highlight of the album is I've Been Young, which is just like so,
Oh yeah, yeah.
it invokes the Tears for Fears, which is a reference point that you brought up when
The
we
vocals, yeah.
beforehand, but it also just has this hugeness to it, and this, it stands alone as a kind of jewel on this record. And Justify Your Life is up there as well. And I also think that my other huge standout on this record is the closing track with Hatchie, For You I Will.
Yeah.
My point being, there are some big standout songs on here, but for the most part, to me, this is a record where it's more kind of about the soundscapes and kind of what it is as a totality, as opposed to, I don't really think it's a really strong collection of songs as much as it is just a really great suspended immersion in a particular sonic space that's just so full of color and gleaming detail and just entrancing heft and weight that you get so swept up in it. And for that reason, I think the first time I listened to it, I maybe like slightly overrated it a little bit, just in the sense that first time I heard it, I was like, oh man, yeah, this is right up there with albums of the year. And it's not quite there. I think that the more you listen to it, the more it kind of reveals itself as maybe being a little bit more modest in what it can do than maybe how it initially seems. But that said, as a 38-minute slice of maximalist psychedelia, it's one of the great album experiences of the year so far. It's just something that you get lost in completely and totally. And the songs themselves sort of cycle and iterate and are fairly repetitive in and of themselves, but how glistening and huge and titanic the scale of the sounds are makes that enough, I think. I don't know how well this will age in the long run, and I do think that the amount of adoration it's getting in certain online spaces is maybe going to, wear it out a little bit, or maybe create an unfair expectation for some people who come in a little bit later. But at the moment, it's just sensational. Like for so much of this week, I've had Fucking Up My Life just playing in my head over and over and over.
That hook is so good.
It's you know what? It's not as good as the album I'm about to compare it to, but like the scale of the sound and how kind of just viscerally impressed I am by it on a technical level for that, it feels like this year's Blue Rev. That's an album that has like, is front to back, like really immaculately well crafted pop songs. And this maybe has 3 or 4 songs that hit the level of a record like Blue Rev. But just in terms of the album experience, just that glistening, shining maximalism, that cathedral-sized hugeness, that feels like a rarity in terms of the albums we get to talk about on a week-to-week basis. It goes up there with that for me.
Yeah, I definitely agree, both in like how much I enjoy it and in what its limitations are. I feel like, especially with our new reviews this week, we're kind of examining the finer points of, for lack of a better term, vibe music. I feel like that is the mission statement of the album. It's not that way because it's lacking. It's that way because that is the ambition that it sets out for itself. And I'm not quite on the like one of the best albums of the year train with it either. That said, the overall experience of putting this on, it is very reminiscent of like, actually I really like the Always comp, just because it does, like, the difference between these two is that that album does have the fantastic singularly formed A to B structured pop songs that this doesn't quite have, but that's because their aims are slightly different, even though I still think that like this feels like a conclusion to this sort of arc of George's career. And like, maybe I could be fully wrong in that. Maybe he goes on to make a lot more derivative works that are basically just variations on this exact type of thing, and he'll probably be successful if that's what he does. Still, even though I'm wanting new material from him, I'm no less like unsatisfied with this. This is going to be like great music to just come back to and have like 30 minutes of a great like slate clearing, because despite the fact that, yeah, this could be constant constituted as like maybe even fluffy in some regard. It feels too intentionally designed. It feels too like carefully crafted. There's just nothing that's going to sound quite this amazing or big all year, save for maybe the new Parannoul album, which I mean, we already compared the moment on the opener to Polaris. That's just another album that, like Blue Rev, does a little bit better job of segmenting itself into individual moments.
Well,
But
that
I
record
still
and this,
appreciate the album experience overall with this.
that record and this are like the two most maximal records of the year that I think we've both really did with in terms of sound design.
Yeah.
That is something that, you know, aside from sort of thematic content or artist personality or that kind of thing, that is something that is fairly primal in terms of how we respond to records. For me, like, there's two possible directions that George could go in. I mean, aside from sort of just continuing to make records like this, one is that he could diversify his sound palette and become a little bit more like the Chemical Brothers, where the music becomes less about him and he kind of uses his skill set to apply it to different styles, essentially, or different variations of his
Yeah.
the Chemical Brothers do on their records. You know, maybe get more featured artists and just become a little bit more of a kind of curator of sound. The other potential possibility for him to move from here is to hone in on the sound he's captured here and the kind of, you know, cohesion of its consistency, and work on the songwriting a little bit more and maybe embellish that aspect of who he is. And I don't know which of those I would prefer. Maybe this, I don't know that I, from this anyway, feel that Clanton is necessarily has the songwriting chops to pull off that second direction, but I would love to see him just continue to kind of sprawl outwards with what he does and use the clear skill that he's showcased here to create a record that really reminds me of something like Chemical Brothers' Surrender or Screamadelica. I mean, the thing I love about a lot of those Manchester records like Screamadelica is that what they are is a patchwork. You know, it's let's take what we're really good at and let's kind of apply it into all these different genre directions. I think that George could do a really good job of doing that. Just on the Always comparison, this is going to seem a little bit glib maybe, but if I were to kind of make a parallel, and again, this is not necessarily about quality, just more about what these respective records do. Blue Rev is kind of like the Pet Sounds to this album's Sergeant Pepper's. You know what I mean? Like Blue Rev is the album.
Yeah.
You know,
like that.
Blue Rev and Pet Sounds are the albums where it's like every song stands out as something as a great fucking song. Whereas Sergeant Pepper's, it's like, yeah, there are great songs on it, like there are great songs on this, but the defining aspect of that record is just the colossal sound of it for where that band has come from and for what they achieve, you know? So, and in that respect, I think that For You I Will kind of is George Clanton's Day in the Life almost. Like, that's not great fitting, because Day in the Life is a great song and a great piece of musical, you know, maximalism. But I just, I'm on a fucking cloud listening to this. I'm like through the galaxy. I'm in the fucking, you know, I'm transcending. Absolutely. While I'm listening to this, because of just how, you know, just intensely euphoric so much of it is. But For You I Will is like the fucking Stargate sequence in 2000. That's when I level up, you know, in a way that I wasn't expecting the record to go. It's just, and part of it is Hatchie's vocal contributions as well, which are just add this
fantastic,
massively dreamy and colossal, you know, aspect to it. You know, it's interesting. Her album from last year, Giving the World Away, also took a lot from, you know, Baggy and Manchester and that kind of like 90s psychedelic Britpop thing. And it was kind of her doing it in her own way. And I definitely resonate a little bit more with George's approach to that than hers, but I've always like wanted to connect with her a little bit more than I have. And this is kind of like, to me, so far from what I've heard, the best execution of those sets of influences in a modern context. All right, let's move into the Event album, one of the biggest records to come out recently that we've reviewed, Travis Scott's long-awaited Utopia, the follow-up to his 2018 Colossus Astroworld, one of the biggest albums commercially of the 2010s, certainly of the late 2010s at the very least. And Travis Scott himself, one of the biggest artists of the 2010s, I would say, fairly indisputably. Like one of the most listened, one of the most championed, someone who's inspired endless debates about, you know, which projects are the best, which project, people listening to him, people loving him. Travis Scott's a household name, basically. And what I've really found interesting about that is So Travis Scott, far from being the first to really push the sound of Southern trap into a kind of hyper modern, sort of really synthetic and I guess heavy, bassy, brutal, large space. Far from being the first person to do that. He's arguably the most successful and the most influential artist in the, I guess, progression of trap in the 2010s. He's taken it the furthest. He's had the most tangible change in how that sort of subgenre, sub-style of modern hip hop has evolved, to the extent that when you think of trap music, trap type beat, it's either Travis or Future that you probably think of, but Travis is maybe the most sort of commanding and demanding, and someone who I suppose has kind of maintained relevance in the way that Future hasn't. So Travis is the biggest name in trap. And what I found interesting about that is, Travis's earlier stuff, Days Before Rodeo, and of course the massive crossover hit Rodeo, which is one of my favorite records of 2015. Those are quite charismatic records, but also records where Travis is more of a presence than a personality. Those are, and that's kind of been Travis's thing. I don't want to diminish the extent to which he has a three-dimensional artistic personality. I do think it exists in his earlier work, but the bigger he's gotten, the more he's sort of, I don't want to say homogenized himself, because that's not strictly true. I still think that Travis is unmistakably Travis. You could never hear a Travis Scott song and think that it's by anyone else, which is still really impressive. But Travis commands my interest for how loud and declarative and intense and just kind of physical his music is, more so than the kind of person he is. And that's a distinction with someone like Future as well. And part of Future's decline has kind of been sanding off the edges of his personality in more recent years compared to his kind of Imperial era in 2012, 2013 through 2015, 2016. So that's one distinction. But Travis is fascinating in the way that he's kind of evolved from that early era to be the world's foremost cultivator of vibes, cultivator of heavy, atmospheric, booming vibes. And that's something that, was both the strength and the kind of core weakness of a record like Astro World as well, which is, as fascinating and kind of, engaging and entertaining as it is frustrating and kind of self-indulgent. And Travis is an artist who's, within his self-indulgence, has walked the line between being compelling and asinine. He's somewhere between Kanye and Drake, who are two heavy influences and collaborators in his process as well. I am gonna make an especially strong point about Kanye, because I think Kanye hangs heavily over this in a way that is, I would say, impossible to ignore if you want to meaningfully review the record. Travis is a protege of Kanye, and Kanye is an artist who, in as much as he's influenced every major hip-hop artist of the 2010s, he's had a particularly profound influence on Travis. And Utopia, I think, is the record where that is the most pronounced. Kanye is involved behind the scenes more in a kind of, I think, executive role than in a direct creative role, though he does have creative credits on this. But, Travis worked extensively with Mike Dean to master and mix this, and a lot of the production collaborations, as well as, actually, no, beyond just that surface level background stuff, there's a lot of this record where, to me, it feels like Travis is approximating Kanye. He's evoking modern Kanye in performance. He's evoking modern Kanye in production. What I mean by those things are, there are Kanye flows that Travis has throughout this record, and there are musical decisions and beat constructions and things that feel very much like later era Kanye. There's specific elements that evoke Yeezus. In fact, I feel very strongly, my kind of core thesis for this is that this is sort of Travis trying to make his Yeezus. And there's also elements that feel heavily influenced by this kind of current Donda era of where Kanye's at in terms of hyper minimalist, like in terms of what the songs contain, but maximalist in terms of how loud and in your face those bare elements are. And so the product is something that's fascinatingly connected to that, and also a product of Travis's own desire to craft a, epochal moment encapsulating masterpiece. He's been building this up for several years. And what I like about us approaching this, we haven't planned this conversation anyway, but we're going to be approaching this in a way that I think maybe is slightly counterintuitive to what you might expect, because I know, Jake, that you're quite enthusiastic about this. And while I think there are aspects of this that really, really work, I think that this is kind of a big misfire. And so I'm interested in how we both are going to approach our particular feelings on this. But I'm glad that we're coming at it from different places, because it has been not super polarizing, but I have seen a variety. I've seen a spectrum of responses to this from Travis fans and casual music fans in general. So Jake, I want to, but the broad reaction has been positive. So Jake, I want to turn to you, and I want to hear from you what you think about this record, about what you think about where Travis is at, about how much Travis appeals to you, and what do you think about this record specifically and its successes?
Travis, to me, is somebody I find endlessly fascinating, mainly because of his, domineering, inescapable presence in modern music and pop culture, and because simultaneously, there is a lot about him that is unmistakably, like, you can attribute certain signifiers to him, but at the same time, I wouldn't say that Travis is overwhelmingly imbued with a very singular personality. I mean, like, I think a common conception with him is that he's usually, like, no matter how good or competent or, I mean, even relatively great he can be on a given song, he's kind of by virtue just the least interesting part of his music. And I don't even necessarily disagree with that fact, even though I would argue that Travis is really more of a great all-rounder and is also focusing way more on the curation aspect of the construction of his music anyway. As a performer, he's a little bit more straight functional than anything else. That said, I inexplicably find myself really compelled by most of what this guy has made, which may come as a surprise to most people because, I mean, I've kind of been waiting for this moment to happen, in that we finally get to review a high-profile trap release from somebody that I actually really like.
Flashbacks to
Even
Whole Lotta Red here.
Yeah, exactly. And I even still kind of understand, like, I don't even know what particularly might grind your gears about this album, just because we haven't, like, led off this discussion with our opinions or anything, like, with each other in isolation. But this album, Utopia, I feel like is, like, undeniably kind of a mess, because Astroworld is undeniably kind of a mess. And I also really like it. And that's not just because, like, it's not for facile reasons either. I like most people generally think that, like, Rodeo is his best album. A great record, honestly, like a highlight in hip hop from that year for sure. A really consistent record at that. I really enjoy basically everything on there. But even as far back as Rodeo, I feel like you can isolate little individual things about Travis that could be a sticking point for some people, like the lyrical occupations of his work. Not exactly interesting, not exactly singular. Like, Travis doesn't even feel like he's going out of the way to make music that feels personable in any respect. He is indulging in often tread hip hop cliches, and I feel like oftentimes in tandem with the bigness of his sound, that's kind of the point. It's to be an aesthetic, textural, rhythmic, head bobbing experience. And he just does that so fucking well on albums like Rodeo, and even like Astroworld slightly less successfully, but still overwhelmingly to a degree to which I enjoy those records a lot. But even still, on an album like Rodeo, for example, take Pray for Love, one of the bigger songs on that album. One of the songs I've listened to the most on there. Great song, virtually hookless. Like this song is verse, 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 done. Like it has really nothing instrumental about a hook either. It's kind of amorphous and it doesn't really build to a satisfying climax. And yet it just goes. I really like everything about the atmosphere of it. I love the production. I love the size, and I love how commanding Travis feels. I have a weird relationship with his work where I always respect the ambition because he's always a big conceptual framework guy. And I think the continually interesting thing about him to me is that even on Rodeo, I don't really ever feel like he fully hits his potential, but he's always trying really fucking hard and gets like most of the way there. And then you have Utopia here, which is all of his messy, ambitious, fringe tendencies combined with the fact that he's obviously from that sort of Mike Dean minimalist production style that we found on Donda, except to me anyway, this is kind of like the album that I personally wanted Donda to be, in that it just ended up being so like myopic in terms of what Kanye was trying to do that, like he often does, he just kind of disappeared up his own ass, and the album just ends up being something that I don't really have much to engage with on. Whereas here, that's very different. Travis is making music for a pop audience. He's making music with an audience in mind. Kanye is not. That is the difference between the two of them. And it leads to a combination of accessibility at its best moments that I really enjoy, and a kind of sprawling ambition that I always appreciate and have a good time with. And it's best showcased on what I think is the best song Travis Scott has ever made, the opener on here, Hyena. Cards on the Table. I flat fucking adore this song. It is flawless. When I look for what I look for in Travis Scott's music is 110% this. The drums on this song sound utterly impossible. They are here to do one thing, and that is cave your skull in, because they sound like the presence of a deity. I was slack-jawed when I heard this. I'm like, I didn't think that this was humanly possible, but somehow he did it. And it just feels like the perfect distillation of everything about his songwriting structurally that is both ambitious and poppy, and it's melded just flawlessly. It is an experience that I like. This in and of itself, like, this is the ideal Utopia moment. I was like, all right, I'm locked into this. Let's go.
Yeah.
And the disappointing thing is that the album just never really quite touches that high again. It has many high points, in my opinion. I mean, like, My Eyes kind of dials everything back from the sort of adrenaline rush of those opening three kind of like really great songs.
That one's my favorite on the record. I'll get to why.
It's also one of the more like vulnerable and kind of introspective moments where it actually kind of like, you kind of feel like Travis is an actual person, which you don't really often always get. And it feels like this album does kind of convey a little bit of Travis's interiority in a way that not all of his other albums are primarily focused on doing. It's a little bit more at the forefront here, even though I'd still argue that it's very messy and scattered in that approach. There are certainly moments that I'm just not super fond of that could be trimmed, like God's Country and Parasail, that are just kind of half-baked. But for every one of those on here, there's a moment like the Playboy Cardi featuring Fiend, which has, again, one of the best beats this man has ever laid down.
You are
so
correct.
Fucking hard, man.
Yes.
I love it.
Yeah.
And there's also moments on here like the very unexpected Del Resto, where Beyonce comes on here sounding just as lively and
trading off
as she
with
did on
Boney
Renaissance.
Beer and his full like I'm in it guys. God, that was so surreal
Yes.
experience. That was
It's
so surreal.
and it's wonderful. That kind of big brain shit is exactly what I appreciate the most about Travis Scott. Meltdown, I actually really enjoy, even though again Drake is kind of lame as hell on here, but that's just kind of all part and parcel of the experience. Circus Maximus is one of the most Kanye derivative songs on here, and despite my better judgment, I really like it, even though it's basically a soft remake of Black Skinhead featuring The Weeknd. But it's hard. I don't know what else to say. And I'm also like, people really fucking hated K-pop as a lead single. I did not listen to this song at all, so I was like dreading waiting for it. It has like a fucking like the lowest by far rating of it on Rate Your Music. And then I listened to it and I was like, this is good. I like this. Like I see no discernible difference between this song and a bunch of the other very acceptable B tier enjoyable Travis Scott cuts that are on this song and are on Astroworld. Like it's a little sloppy structurally, but I don't get the overwhelming hate that it seems to have. Like I've even seen Travis Scott fans be like, it's just bewildering that was a lead single. I don't get it. I think it's kind of hard. But like, yes, this thing is too long. This thing is unwieldy. It doesn't always fulfill its potential, but it capitalizes on his strengths almost better than I feel like it ever has. And I just really get along with this rougher, minimalist sound because it caves my fucking skull in. I really appreciate the extremes that this goes for.
It's a tale as old as time. Massively successful rapper, one of the biggest names in the world, is not satisfied with his life, has it all, still wants more. This has been an interesting album to process throughout the week. Somewhat unsurprisingly, and I don't necessarily think I was expecting this to be a fully realized thematic concept. I get very little of where Travis is coming from with the concept of Utopia on this. There's occasional moments where it's referenced, and Travis's conception of it, vis-a-vis Drake's voice anyway, seems to be, wherever you are, which is as vacuous and meaningless as I was probably expecting it to be. And here's the thing about Travis, and I was kind of alluding to this when I sort of set up my thoughts earlier, and you've said this as well in your thoughts, Jake, is that in a sense, he's the least interesting part of his music. Not completely. I think Travis has an incredible voice, just one of the most declarative and recognizable and just quite attention-grabbing voices. And
he's got a great presence.
Music. Yeah, exactly. But as a personality, and again, more so in his recent stuff compared to some of the earlier stuff, he's kind of gone. And he's not unique in that respect. There's a lot of huge artists who, artists like Kanye, but also artists like Cardi, for instance, who can make these massive, immense, all-consuming, sonically overwhelming records that use that intensity as the gravity, as the force that is what people get from the record, what people come to the record for, and what sort of defines its identity. They don't need their personality to be a huge part of it. Although I would say that, for instance, in the case of Cardi, his personality is a huge part of what makes his records work for the people who like them. Travis, there are moments on this where I think Travis really comes through and is a powerful presence, as well as someone who I find compelling inside of his own narrative of being sort of trapped and looking for some kind of utopia, looking for some kind of suspended, sustained satisfaction that eludes him. And that for that reason, I do think My Eyes is the best song on the album. It's notably also the only song where Travis in any way references the Astroworld tragedy. Not that I need him to, or not that he has any obligation to, just that it's interesting that he chooses to only refer to that in one line of one song. And maybe that's wise. Maybe if Travis went too far to account for it and how it has come to change and twist the narrative around him, it's probably wise that he's avoided that for the most part. But it's interesting because when he does mention it, he specifically refers to, wishing he could save a child because, there was a 9-year-old kid who died in that tragedy. It's such an intense moment. It's so viscerally real that it completely throws me out of balance.
And nothing else like that happens on the album again.
Yeah, and the song itself is beautiful. It takes that massive sort of huge cathedral-sized sound and applies it to something so isolating and lonely and intimate that contrast is really, really powerful and affecting. And Travis's performance is great on here. I feel a sense of life and vividness coming through. But much of this, and I think especially in the second half, I think this is a record that absolutely has the vast majority of its high points in the first half. As it goes on, Travis becomes less and less of a presence and less knowable. This is the thing. You feel as though when you're spending your time in the presence of an artist within their world, within their project, you would think that regardless of how much you're enjoying the record or how good you think the songs are, you would think as a product of experiencing that, especially when you're talking about an hour-plus album, as it goes on, you would get to have a better and better impression of who the artist is and where they're at. But a weird experience for me with Travis here is that I feel less and less sure and less interested in who he is and what he's trying to convey as this record goes on. It gets so much mileage out of how hard it hits from the gate. Like, no hot takes from me. Hyena is a huge song. I mean, it opens with a Gentle Giant sample, and then it ends with a Funkadelic sample. So already Travis is kind of channeling progressive rock and funk, in a weird sense.
I mean, it's like Kanye on My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy sampling King Crimson. It's that level of ambition.
Yeah, well, it's saying something. I'm not sure what it's saying, but it is saying
something.
And it catches your ear. And you mentioned how Circus Maximus it deliberately evokes Black Skinhead. I mean, the drum beat in the song is like almost verbatim, an attempt to kind of recapture that. And as I mentioned earlier, Travis has flows throughout this record that very much remind me a lot of da 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 da, like this very kind of staccato, blunt, blank, straightforward, short thing that Kanye goes for, matched by an increase in the vacuousness of what Travis is talking about across this record. I mean, he recycles himself and he kind of tunnels into himself, and it almost seems as though he's desperately trying to kind of mine some kind of significant observation about his life or commentary about where he's at, but ultimately just can't really get there. I'm as interested in Travis's life and Travis's struggles after listening to this as I am in those of DJ Khaled. It's just, I get nothing real about Travis. And not that I need that, because like some artists are able to just be empty but compel you through the sheer intensity of what they do. That's something that, Cardi's able to do that to a certain extent as well. But Travis is just not able to compel me in that way for as long as he would like to. And ultimately, I get a little bit fatigued the more and more he attempts to. And also, I think part of the appeal of artists who just throttle you and immerse you in their hedonistic lifestyle is that while they can be quite dour and dark and dramatic and depressing in how they talk about it and in the places they've taken it to, they don't really take themselves all that seriously, or the music doesn't portray a self-seriousness. And I think if it did, it would jar you from the experience, and it would make you feel a little bit less able to kind of just enjoy it for the pure head rush that it is, because it's like, well, suddenly this person is really trying to meaningfully communicate their lives in a way that they want us to kind of interrogate. Travis, I feel like, is trying to do that to a certain extent with this album. Travis is caught between trying to meaningfully talk about his life and wanting to meaningfully talk about his life, but also, for whatever reason, not really being willing to introspect all that much it's a weird place that he's in, caught between those two states throughout this record. And as a
The
result,
Highs kind of feels like a checklist moment where it's like, all right, here's the somber, emotional, ballad-esque song, so now we can get that out of the way, you know?
and as a result of that, you have songs like I Know and Utopia Twins and Schizo, which stand out to me as irritatingly blank in the way he expresses himself, while at the same time posturing towards some kind of more significant takeaway that I don't think it earns. Then there are songs like Love and K-pop and I don't know, God's Country, I suppose, that just don't work for me musically, frankly, all that much. I kind of agree with you that I don't see why K-pop is seen as especially poor, but it is not a song that I think works all that well. To an extent, Travis recognizes that he's a great cultivator of vibes and that he's a great kind of ringleader, right? He's a great circus master. And this is kind of something that he was sort of leaning into with the concept of Astroworld.
Yeah.
Is he's a great orchestrator, right? And he's great at bringing in features and lining things up and letting you have the thrill rush of like, okay, here's Drake. Okay, here's Cardi. Okay, here's Beyonce. Okay, here's 21 Savage. Okay, here's The Weeknd. Okay, here's Young Thug. Okay, here's West Side Gun. You know, bang, 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 bang. He's great at giving you, you know, a massive sound that also lets you kind of experience these huge artists and, you know, these memorable moments lined up one after another that makes it all feel like an event, makes it all feel like it's kind of, you know, a big pop culture celebration.
Momentous.
And it feels as though Travis, you know, on the one hand, he does that with this record, he sets those things up. On the other hand, I don't feel that any of the features on this particularly stand out as all that impressive for these individual artists. It's nice when SZA shows up, although I kind of feel a little bit cool on, you know, how exciting I find her contributions. Kid Cudi's basically anonymous on Love. West Side Gun is okay on Lost Forever, but also kind of irritating in this context for me.
Yeah, I'm not actually a big fan of the West Side Gun feature either.
Beyonce works because Beyonce is Beyonce and she's not really doing any, and the song itself kind of feels like it's a little bit culled from Renaissance. I feel like he's kind of targeted her feature to kind of fit in with the vibe she was going for on that record. I like Drake's feature on Meltdown, but it is very much yet another in a long line of Drake and Travis Scott collaborations where they are talking about very specific grievances and beefs they had within their own personal lives with like brands and you know, people and teams and corporations, all that kind of stuff, that you really have to be invested in that narrative of their lives.
Like I cannot fathom conceptually a thing that I could care about less in a song than Drake having beef with Nike or whatever the fuck. Like I just,
well, like half of his verse is talking about his ongoing feud with Vogue, and it's just like I could not give a shit. You know, it's like the thematic content of it is like, you know, continuing from her loss, which I'm not gonna, whatever.
nah.
The most successful feature on this record, I think, is Playboy Cardi's, and the reason for that is that Fiend, the song that he's on, is essentially just a Cardi song. His contributions,
Travis sounds like Cardi on here.
and you know, everything about it is just channeling Cardi's world and Cardi's aesthetic, and you know, imbuing it with that weight and heft and craft that someone like Mike Dean has brought to, you know, the scope and scale of this. So it works really, really well. It's definitely one of the standouts on the record. When the beat drops early into this song, it feels legitimately earth-shaking, and that just it's a thumper. It just completely delivers. So many of the other features on this record lack the personality that I know that those artists can bring to their features when they're really, really switched on and enthusiastic. And so part of the failure of this record is that Travis is unable to really compellingly bring together that circus of big names and make it feel as though that it's exciting from moment to moment to experience them in this context with this huge sound that he's constructed. And also at the same time, that goal that feels to me to be very much a rehash of what he did with Astroworld is in conflict with this half-hearted attempt to be more personal and to be more introspective and to be more real about his life. And if Travis were himself better able to construct a personality, you know, like an actually charismatic personality, maybe I would care more, even if the lyricism was just as shallow. But there's only so many times I can listen to him going on about fucking bitches, fucking twins. Utopia Twins is like simultaneously one of the funniest songs on this record and also one of the most irritating. You know, this I have to admit that this feature from Rob 49, who I'm not familiar with,
Yeah.
it made me laugh out loud the first time I heard it. Some genuinely funny bars. Way I shoot my shot at all these hoes, I fuck my shoulder up. Travis, what if they twins and they Siamese, but they want to fuck us both?
That's not even.
How do you even like think of that? Like, what?
The answer is that you get really,
That's
really
the kind of
high.
That's the kind of bar that makes me uncomfortable, and I don't know why. I feel like you just shouldn't be talking about fucking Siamese twins. Like, that's just not a concept that you shouldn't be, you know, going for. And then the next line, buy her what she want and suck her toes. I'm trying to make her come. Like, maybe I'm just so washed. But is that a thing? Do people come from having their toes sucked? I thought that toe sucking was a thing that was for the toe sucker. I thought that was a thing that was gratifying for the toe. I didn't realize that toe sucking could be a thing that was, you know, a source of extreme stimulation for the recipient. But Rob 49 is making me think about these things. So I value him for that. That in itself is entertaining, but then it's just the rest of the song is just hearing Travis talk about fucking a bitch. She's cold, give her a mink. She's on my jet ski. Twin bitches hopping on the jet skis. Twin jet skis. Twin Glocks. Twin Drax. I got two of everything. The whole meme is like, oh, I'm so rich. I've got two of everything. And I just, when they're just like riffing and joking around like this, that's when it feels the most, you know, that's when it feels the most accessible to me. But also, I don't know. It's just irritating. It's just that they're not quite good enough to sell that. There's only so long I can spend listening to, like, you know, 21 Savage is on the song as well. And I have a love-hate relationship with 21 Savage. I probably lean more towards disliking him, even though he feels like the kind of artist I should like. It's just this motherfucker. I can't stand listening to him talk about, she give me wet mouth, I need a mop. I don't want that clean head little bitch. I want that slop. Like, I just
Not
get
slop.
It's just disgusting. I'm not like vibing this shit. I'm like, I need to wash my hands. That's something I don't particularly get on with. Within this album, there's a good chunk that really delivers on Travis's ability to create this really visceral, chaotic, sensational head trap. And for whatever reason, Travis seems to me to be unable, unwilling, or maybe unmotivated to really fully pull that across. As I've said, emblematic of that is how incoherent and completely unrealized this concept of utopia is. And again, I wouldn't have a problem with that if it weren't something he was hyping up for 3 fucking years leading up to this. You know, Travis's utopia. I'm going to take you to the utopia. I'm going to show you my utopia. And I get a sense of the shallowness of Travis's life to a certain extent, but I get nothing more than that. It's a cheap joke. You know, oh yeah, my utopia is that I have everything and it's great. I don't get it. It doesn't compel me. Travis feels increasingly more anonymous and more unengaged and more just sort of like a wallpaper within his own record as it goes on. And it's a real shame because even a record like Astro World, which I like a little bit more than this, and if I'm going to put my critic's hat on, I'm going to say it has a lot of limitations and yada, yada, yada. Every Travis record I've heard has within it a sense of commitment and enthusiasm and excitement for what he's doing. It wanes a little bit on Astro World. It's something that he does struggle to maintain across the entirety of that record. But here it feels particularly limp to me. Like a lot of what is appealing and successful and exciting about this record is really, really shallow aesthetic stuff that the magic of wears off fairly quickly for me. I'll take my Hyena, I'll take my Eyes, I'll take Fiend, and I'll take Telekinesis to a certain extent as well, which I do really like at the back half of this record. I think that's a really strong song. The rest of it just feels so incoherent and uncommitted. Two of the presences on this album that are fairly frequent in terms of background elemental stuff is James Blake and Bon Iver. And you know, my relationship with Travis is a lot like my relationship with them, in the sense that in between like 2012 and 2015, they were both like as cool as you could possibly be to me. Like they were both immense and exciting architects of these hugely enveloping sonic worlds. And, you know, to the extent to which I knew them and could resonate with their personalities really didn't matter. And now I'm kind of at a point where it's like, I need something more from you. And the things, it's like being in a relationship for a really long time. The things that once attracted me to you are now exhausting and fatiguing and repetitive. And I'm just kind of begging you to grow up a bit.
I think that it's just that Travis is such an accomplished aestheticist, and that this particular incarnation of his sound, regardless of how sloppily it's employed, is so innately compelling to me that he can just kind of ride through this experience, even if not all of it is him at 100%. The features, which I agree aren't all great either, but they provide enough variation throughout the experience to make me feel like this isn't monotonous, to make me feel like this, I don't get like a fatigue when listening to this. But at the end of the day, I, like you, am probably going to come back to lots of single songs from this album, you know, like 5 or 6 like truly great songs. And I'm probably not going to listen to the entirety of this anymore anytime soon, just because it's a bit exhausting, frankly, even at its most enjoyable.
Yeah.
Another critic we follow sometimes is Mark Spectrum Pulse, and I remember reading something he had written about Travis Scott, where he talked about basically the dichotomy of his relationship, which is very similar to your relationship with Travis's music, is that, you know, that the lyrical parts of Travis's music are, you know, more tangential. They're more flavorings than anything else for the impact and immediacy of the sound. But his argument is, well, why can't you have both of these things? Because there are definitely other artists who do what Travis does sonically, but do also provide something a little bit more meaningful when it comes to lyricism. I mean, the thought that keeps coming to mind for me, at least, is Denzel Curry, who I think is basically our, like, he's my Travis Scott. Like, for most people, he is to me what Travis Scott is to them. Essentially, it's an experience that feels like it sounds so big, it sounds so expensive that it can get by on being a little bit shallow with me.
I'll wrap up by saying this. I'm glad Travis seems to be still committed to making event albums. I mean, this is going to be one of the albums of the year. It's nice to have an album that's hopefully going to stay this big. I mean, we can't tell how its longevity will be in the public consciousness, but hopefully, you know, we've needed a hip hop album to be big because this year has been so dominated by big country records. I'm glad Travis is committed to making big event albums. And that's one of the biggest ways in which he continues to wear his Kanye influence on his sleeve, is that, like Kanye, he believes everything that he puts out should feel as though it matters and should have this weight and circumstance around it. And I think that's a great thing for our big artists to have. And I love that Travis is still imbuing his records with that. I have a good deal of fondness for a decent amount of this. And I like it more, again, I like it more in concept. I like it more for what it is in the scheme of popular culture than I think it works as an album. And that's okay. And I'm fine with that. His albums feel like statements, but you want the album to really nail the paragraph. And I think,
yeah, that's fair.
It's okay. I'm going to end there because that's not that's the most inelegant way I could finalize my thoughts. But this is an inelegant
Okay.
album, so it works. All right, let us know at home what you think of either of the albums we've discussed today. Travis Scott's Utopia and George Clanton's Ooh Rap Aya. Do you agree with us? Do you enjoy these albums even more than us or even less than us? What are your takes on the albums? How do you feel the albums will last in terms of their shelf life as well? Do you think the Clanton album will still be something people are talking about as album of the year, a contender at the end of the year? How do you feel Utopia will age in terms of Travis Scott's relevance, in terms of Travis Scott's ability to make a record that sticks with people? Do you think it'll hang around? Do you think it'll age well, or do you think people are already starting to move on? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Really looking forward to hearing your takes and continuing the conversation. Until next time, though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago. Pokemon, gotta catch 'em all.